Thanks for joining this training on how to plan your garden and grow more of your own food. Appreciate taking time out of your busy day to join me. My name is Jason Matthias. My wife Shannon and I have 7 kids from the ages of 16 down to 6. And you may have seen me speak before at any one of a number of online events, such as these. I've been speaking at the Homegrown Food Summit for many years and have had the pleasure to speak at the Mother Earth News Online Summit, the Superfood Garden Summit, as well as the Homesteaders of America Conference. Our family owns and operates Seeds Generations, which is an heirloom seed company providing garden seeds and a gardening inspiration for families like yours. We've been doing this for about 7 years now, and it really grew out of a love for gardening and a love for seeds that started when I was very young. As an infant, even, I was in the garden with my parents and eating fresh vegetables out of the garden. And I'm continuing that tradition with my kids, teaching them how to grow their own food and to appreciate real food and where it comes from and the challenge in raising it. My background, if you didn't already know, was as an Air Force pilot. I spent 11 years on active duty flying KC-10 air refueling tankers all over the world, and spent the last few years on active duty with the Army as a liaison officer, and went to Afghanistan a couple times with the 10th Mountain Division. I found that I was away from my family too much, and I wasn't going to be able to have the kind of time with my family that I wanted, so I realized when we started having children that I needed to pursue a different path. And so 11 years in, I decided to leave active duty and go to the reserves, and I retired from the Air Force Reserves a couple of years ago. And as I looked at what to do in my civilian life, I realized that in order to have the kind of family life we wanted to have, including gardening and raising animals, I needed to have something that gave me flexibility. And so I pursued an entrepreneurial path, and through many twists and turns, we arrived in Virginia 10 years ago, and in the last few years at our current homestead in a beautiful mountain valley in Western Virginia, west of Roanoke. We're very blessed to have inherited this or taken over this homestead from another homesteading family that we met when we first moved here. And we're continuing to develop it and improve it. And one of the things that we love is every spring, when the weather starts warming up and the ground dries out enough, to get out and work the ground with the kids and get the garden ready for planting, which we'll be doing soon, probably in the next month or so. We're actually doing some of it as weather allows now, but in earnest in a month or so. And the kids are involved in all aspects, whether it's planting potatoes in the early spring or harvesting fresh cucumbers in the summer, getting out there and picking potato bugs off of potatoes together, harvesting tomatoes from the garden in the late summer. Some of our favorites that the kids love are green beans and tomatoes, and even things that aren't as easy to eat right from the garden, like sweet potatoes, offer a fun challenge to do together as a team, as well as potatoes in the fall. We grow and preserve most of our fresh fruits and vegetables, as well as a lot of the preservable fruits and vegetables that we eat every year. Everything from onions and garlic to tomatoes, radishes, cucumbers, winter squash, and everything in between. Very blessed to live in this beautiful place and call it our home. We got here through a journey that took a decade and a half, starting with my wife and I kind of realizing we needed to improve our diet and find better sources of food. And as the Lord made opportunity for us to raise more of our own food, we've done so. That journey is what I like to refer to as a return to the old paths, and it inspired my work on a documentary film that was released a number of years ago called Beyond Off Grid. If you're not already familiar with that, you can go to returntotheoldpaths.com to learn more. All right, with that, let's talk about what we're going to cover in this training. So realizing there's a wide range of people who will be watching this. You might be a beginner gardener who's never done anything before, and so there's a lot of stuff that's new to you. Or you may have been gardening for a long time and just looking for some additional tips and tricks. I'm going to try to speak to all of you. There will be some information that is kind of basic and introductory, so bear with me if you've done this before. But the first thing we're going to talk about is how to plan and position a new garden plot. Because whether you're starting gardening for the first time or like a lot of people that I've heard from, they've been gardening before, but they really want to increase their food production this year, which I think is a very wise thing to be doing in the current context. We're going to talk about some factors to consider and how to do that. We'll also talk about how to calculate the amount of space that you have available using various gardening methods so that you can determine how much you need to plan for in terms of planting seedlings indoors as well as preparing to plant seeds in the garden. We'll talk about for spring planting how to use your last average frost date to plan your seed starting dates and transplanting dates. We'll talk about how to optimize the use of your available garden space to get the most out of your garden. We'll talk a little bit about some other topics such as successive plantings so that you can keep the harvest coming throughout the year. And then also we'll talk about how you can plan to preserve the harvest so that you cannot waste any of it, but continue to enjoy it even after the garden has stopped producing. Hopefully there will be at least a few eye-opening revelations for you in this presentation. So with that, let's jump in. Your coffee table may look something like this at this time of the year, which is good. And that means that it's time to start planning your garden. So let's talk about what we're going to be planning, what we're going to be talking about in this planning discussion. We're going to talk about several basic areas of topics. The first one will be constraints that you will be facing in various forms, planning factors that you need to account for, variables that you can control, production or output and things to plan for so you can make that process efficient, and then also things to consider when preserving the harvest. Starting with constraints, there are some constraints that you can't really get around without effort, and these are soil, sunlight, the amount of space you have available to grow in, the location of your garden, and this is both your location on the map as well as your location, the characteristics of your location, such as trees and that kind of stuff. We'll talk the amount of rainfall you get in your location and your season length. So when we think about soil, there are some important factors you want to consider, but first, a good quote from Joel Salatin. You can't have a healthy civilization without healthy soil. You can't have junk food and have healthy people. So health starts with the health of your soil. And let's talk about the factors you want to consider when looking at your soil. First thing you want to do is get a soil test. Now, you may have had a soil test in the past, but soil can change over time. And so if it's been a few years since your last soil test, it's good to do this. You can usually order a kit from your local agricultural college extension and have instructions on how to take the soil sample and then put it in the box and ship it in to the lab to get tested. The qualities that you're looking for, hoping for, are high organic matter, a balanced pH. The soil structure that's ideal is called sandy loam, but that doesn't mean that if you have something else that you can't grow a good garden in it. So with soil, if you build it, your plants will thrive. So if you're starting out with very poor soil, you want to improve your soil, but it may take a long time to build because if you have a lot of clay in particular, it takes a long time and it's hard to amend very hard clay soil. So if that is your case, then you probably want to consider using raised beds and import soil by buying it in bags or in bulk. A lot of times you can get either take a pickup truck and get a big tractor scoop of it, put in the pickup truck bed, and then you can load it that way. Or if you need a lot of it, you may be able to order it for delivery with the dump truck. Let's talk about sunlight, which if you have a good amount of, may give you sunflowers. Some general guidelines for sunlight. Um, Soil with more sun warms faster, which means that south and southwest facing slopes are the warmest. They will warm up the earliest in the spring and stay warmer longer into the fall than other slopes, particularly north facing slopes. Some seasonal changes you want to be mindful of as you're planning. The sun is higher in the sky during the summer, which means that the tree shade will be different in the summer than it is in the fall or the spring. This also means that you want to plant tall growing plants on the north side of your garden, unless, of course, you're planning to produce shade that you want to use in a beneficial manner for um, plants that might need it so that they won't go to seed. A good example of this, using shade for beneficial effect, is some leafy greens such as lettuce and also some root vegetables can do very well in a dappled sunlight or part shade, and actually can prolong or delay the process of what's often referred to as bolting, which is when certain plants get heat stress, it triggers the plant to produce seed. And in the case of lettuce, it'll produce a stalk up the middle. And once it does that, the leaves, which are the part that you eat, turn bitter. So bolting is a bad thing with most leafy greens because you're eating the part of the plant that is the solar collection medium and the chemical changes in the plant that happen when it bolts or it starts producing, putting energy toward producing seed. The part that you eat, not very palatable. So having some shade, planting area that is in the shade, especially in the hot part of the summer, can be beneficial for this reason. All right, location. Soil and sunlight are your primary determinations for where you put your garden. Moisture can be an issue, right? So you want to consider your water sources and also the drainage of the spot. So slopes drain water, typically. Depressions pool water, as you can kind of see in this picture. So you want to make sure that you're not putting your garden in a spot that is not going to drain well if you get a large rain event or a lot of rain over a shorter period of time and doesn't have time to soak down into the ground. Heat and sunlight are another factor. Heat-loving plants like okra, tomatoes, peppers, those you want to make sure that you prioritize those plants for getting sun. So if you have limited sun in your garden, particularly because of tree shade, you want to make sure that you put your heat-loving plants in the area that gets the most sun during the day because they're going to do the best there. If you have shade-loving or cool weather plants, then they can often grow in dappled shade, although the yield may be decreased depending on what it is. But generally, if you have something like lettuce or peas that does better in cooler months, then that's actually going to be beneficial to put it in the shade. All right, let's talk about space available and how to calculate that. So you want to take this pattern of sun exposure into account when you're doing your space, determining where you're going to put your garden and how much of it you have available. The shape of the garden area that you have may inform whether you would use a row gardening type setup or a square foot gardening setup. Typically, smaller gardens are going to be using like a square foot gardening, raised bed type of setup, and larger gardens that have longer areas that you can put rows in are going to have a row setup. But this is not a hard and fast rule, obviously. It just tends to be that way. Consider your ability to irrigate in terms of the location. So the amount of water that you're going to need from your water source, right? So if you have a good spot to grow a garden, but it's, couple hundred yards from your nearest spigot, then that means you're going to have to get the water over there. This is not a showstopper, of course. In our case, on our property, we have a lot of hilly land, though we do have some flatter spots. The flatter spots that we have as garden plots are distributed or in different places around our homestead. And it to get water there for irrigation actually requires us to run water long distances, hundreds of feet. And so I'm not going to go into detail about it on this presentation, but we still irrigate, and the way that we get the water to a particular garden plot is by using black poly pipe and running that out to the garden, and then from there we hook it up to an irrigation system. We've settled on using drip tape as our irrigation type setup, and then we have timers with zones that run the irrigation on a schedule. If we get a rainfall event, then we just basically hit a rain delay on the timer, and then it delays it a day or two, depending upon how we set it. And then it picks back up again. So we make sure that our plants are getting all the water that they need to continue growing. You may not always be able to do this if you have a garden plot that's put in a place where it's really hard to get. I'll talk a little bit later about that situation, but if your location gets a lot of rain, you may not need to irrigate, but it is something to keep in mind in order to try to find the optimal location for your garden. All right, so calculating your space available. Basically, your total space available is going to be the sum of all your individual plots areas. Like I said, we have multiple garden plots, so our total space available for growing is the sum of all those plots. An individual plot is basically going to be your growing space in a given plot is going to be the length times the width of the plot minus the total number of square feet of any internal paths in that plot, right? So if you've got a 400 square foot garden, but you have, let's say 100 square feet of it is paths, then you're going to have 300 square feet of growing space left. Fairly straightforward. All right, rainfall. All right, so I'm sorry, I had to take a note there. If you're blessed to live in a place that gets lots of rainfall like we do here, then that's great, but there are some challenges that come with that, right? I mentioned before about depressions, pooling water. You need to make sure you have good drainage if you live in an area that gets lots of rainfall. If you live in a dry region, then your challenge is going to be conserving water, making the most use of it. So some things you can use for water conservation are mulching is probably the primary one, trying to limit the amount of evaporation. Also, having lots of organic matter in your soil is going to be very helpful in that effort. Also, you can look at water harvesting, which is basically, when you do get rain, capturing it and being able to use it later. So you can do everything as from rain barrels to more advanced systems like gray water filtration systems that basically use the water you're already using in your home for like dishwashing and that kind of thing, and capturing it and filtering it and then being able to use it later for your garden. All right, let's talk about your season length, another one of your important constraints. Most people have probably seen this map of frost. I'm sorry, it's a plant hardiness zone map. A lot of people actually refer to zones. A lot of people actually refer to zones when they're talking to other gardeners about like, what's your area like and trying to compare it to theirs. While there is something to be said about the zone that you live in and comparing it to somebody else, it's important to realize what zones actually refer to. Zones that are published on this map by the USDA actually refer to the cold temperatures during the winter, and it's something that is needed to talk about the hardiness of perennial plants, not annual garden vegetables, which most vegetables grown in the garden are annuals. You plant the seed in the spring, it grows into the fall, the frost kills it, you have to do it all over again the next year. Perennials come back year after year, either usually through like the root, and there's not that many garden vegetables that are perennials. Asparagus is one, maybe sunchokes, Jerusalem artichokes. There are a few others, but most are going to be annuals. For most gardeners, the thing that the hardiness zone map is going to be most applicable for them is probably going to be flowers, particularly bulbs like tulips, daffodils, that sort of thing, as well as fruit trees. So it's important to know your zone, but it's even more important to know your frost dates, particularly in the spring when you're growing for your summer garden. Know your last average spring frost date. Now, this date can be found online, at least something close that's based on data from an area near you. The last average spring frost date is the date you're going to be using for calculating your planting dates in the spring. And then, of course, the first average fall frost date is the date you're going to use when you're trying to figure out your fall garden. When is the latest that you can plant something? Detail on that, but I'll mention a little bit later a tool we have to help you use that date to figure out those no later than planting dates. The key word is average, and it's important to realize that if you get a frost date from a local data source, let's say a city that's near you, it's important to know that there can be very large variances in microclimates, even in a relatively close local area. And a good example of this is where we live in the mountains of Virginia. The closest data source frost dates is probably for us going to be like in the Roanoke Valley. The Roanoke Valley is about 20 miles east of us. Roanoke City is down below 1,000 feet elevation. It's in a large mountain valley. It's like a big bowl with big mountains all around it. Where we live, about 20 miles west, is up in a high mountain valley, and we're at 2,500 feet elevation. So the difference in elevation alone leads to fairly significant temperature differences and therefore fairly significant differences in our frost dates. When you couple that with the fact that our microclimate where we're at tends to get a lot of wind and wind chill, it means that our frost date differential can be 3 to 4 weeks from a location that is only 20 miles away from us. Now, we're probably one of the more extreme variances in terms of local area, but you may have be in a similar area where you have that kind of a difference, and it's usually going to be related to mountains and significant elevation differences. Though there can be other microclimate factors such as large lakes creating warm spots and the other things like that. The best thing to do, in addition to researching local data sources for frost date data, is to check with either your local ag extension, because they might have some additional sources of data, or frankly, I find that the best source of data is going to be neighbors, particularly people that have lived in the area for long periods of time, especially multiple generations. Where we live, there are families that have been here literally for over 200 years, and so they have some rules of thumb. One of them being you don't plant stuff in the garden until Mother's Day, particularly things that you're gonna be that don't like frost that you're transplanting into the garden, like basil and those kind of things. So neighbors can be a treasure trove of important information related to gardening. So make sure you get to know your neighbors. Your season length is basically the difference between these two dates. You take the fall um, average first frost date and subtract the last average spring frost date, and that gives you your season length. For most people, it's going to be somewhere between 100 to 140 days, somewhere in there. If you live really far south in Texas or Florida, you might have a longer one, but it's generally going to be in that 120, 130 days is where most people in the middle section of the U.S. are going to be. That'll be important in a couple of ways. Later on, I'll mention how that is a factor. All right, let's talk about planning factors for planting your garden. We'll talk about seed starting lead times. We'll talk about season extension methods that you can consider. Talk about garden size and layout, some plant variety information and crop rotation, and a little bit about protection from predators. All right, so it's important to know your lead times. You can calculate these based on the information that you get on seed packets. Typically, they're going to say something like 8 weeks before the first frost, plant in trays indoors or something like that, and then 2 weeks after the last frost, plant in your garden, something like that, right? So that information is what we're talking about with lead times. Um, Even if you're planting in the garden, you have to still use these calculations to know when to plant them if you're going to plant them as early as possible. And even things that you plant directly into the ground that you might not plant as seedlings indoors and then transplant outside, a lot of those things you're still going to be planting those based upon the date variation, um, X number of weeks before the frost or X number of weeks after the frost, right? So in this simple chart here, I took 5 common garden vegetables and just I want to do an example here. If we use a last frost date of April 15th, basil you plant indoors 6 weeks before the last frost, which would make March 1st the planting date. You plant them outside in the garden 2 weeks after the last frost, which would make the outdoor planting date April 28th. Broccoli is also 6 weeks prior, but you can plant it in the garden 2 weeks prior, which means there's only a month between your indoor and outdoor planting dates. And this is because broccoli is a brassica, and brassicas tend to be fairly cold hardy. They can tolerate some light frosts. Lettuce, plant indoors 5 weeks before the last frost, and you can plant them outdoors at the last frost, so March 8th and April 15th. Now, peppers and tomatoes have a lot more lead times, right? So peppers are 10 weeks before the last frost, which means that February 1st would be the indoor starting date, and planting outside would be April 28th. Tomatoes are 8 weeks prior and 4 weeks after, so February 15th for your indoor date and May 15th for your outdoor date. And you'll see that 4 weeks after the frost can be significantly later. The reason why is tomatoes are kind of tender and they don't like cold even below 40 degrees, let alone a frost. So the extra time there is to allow for the climate to warm up and make sure that they thrive and they're not being stressed by excessive cold. Okay, season extension. If you haven't ever thought about it before, what we just discussed is actually a method of season extension. Transplanting is a method of season extension. You're planting your seeds before you would otherwise be able to plant them outdoors directly in the garden. And then once they get to a certain age and maturity, you're going to plant them outdoors. Or in the case of tomatoes, like I have here, going to transplant them probably into larger containers, like little pots, because you do have to wait until about 4 weeks after the last frost before you put them into the garden. One thing to note here with tomatoes in particular, and possibly peppers, um, space can be a factor. Your indoor space can be a factor because although you can fit, 40 or 50 or more tomato plants in a tray when they're small, when you have to transplant them into bigger pots like you see on the right, suddenly you're multiplying the amount of space required. We use soil blocks, which you see on the left, for planting our seedlings in, and I can fit 50 of them in a 10 by 20 tray. When I transplant them, can only fit about 10, or if I'm using like small 3-inch pots, about 15 in each of those trays. So I'm multiplying the number of trays by like 4 or 5. And what that means is that if I have a limited amount of space indoors under grow lights, suddenly I've multiplied the number of trays I have. I have this conundrum, right? I either need to have more lights or I need to basically put them outside but protect them. We'll talk a little bit later about how you can be able to do that, particularly with things that need to be protected from cold temperatures and frost. A greenhouse is another obviously method of season extension, probably one of the most obvious ones that people think of. You obviously can have very elaborate, expensive, high tunnel commercial type greenhouses, or you can do something as simple as this PVC constructed greenhouse that I made, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. This is basically just 20-foot PVC arches for the arches, and then it's 20 feet long as well and 12 feet wide. Basically, use PVC for the hoops and 6 mil plastic for the covering. You can use greenhouse plastic; it's just more expensive. In this case, I didn't necessarily need to have it last multiple years because I wasn't going to be using it, staying in this location for that long. So, this was a simple greenhouse, small high tunnel that I built with for less than $200. So, and we grew tomatoes in there until November. It was pretty cool to have tomatoes, ripe tomatoes for Thanksgiving. Another method of season extension are cold frames, which are anti-frost and also can be heating depending on if you have a heat source in there. Technically, a frame with a heat source in it is called a hot frame, but you put a heat mass in there, even like a bucket of water that can absorb the heat during the day, then that can radiate heat off at night and can basically stabilize the temperature so it doesn't dip as low at night. This picture is an example of a simply constructed cold frame. It's temporary, obviously, but the nice thing about this is they're using straw bales or hay bales for the walls. Hay straw has a lot of insulative property. A lot of air is trapped in there. And then for the top, they made a simple wooden frame and covered it with sheet plastic, clear sheet plastic, and they have a little PVC pipe that they roll up the lid with, and they're doing that to ventilate it, obviously, right? Most cold frames are going to have some kind of a solid top panel, whether it's glass or Lexan or even a frame like this with plastic, but which is attached to it. In that case, then you end up ventilating by lifting one or the other side of the frame to allow the hot air to escape, and so you don't overheat the plant. Very important with cold frames on sunny days, particularly warm sunny days, that you ventilate properly. Otherwise, you can cook your seedlings. Low tunnels, which are basically just plastic or fabric mesh over hoops, can be done simply either with kind of heavy gauge wire used as a hoop, or you can make them with PVC pipe, or you can also use metal EMT conduit that's bent into a hoop. And then this fabric is put over it, which provides several degrees of frost protection. In this picture on the right, we actually have a low tunnel inside of a high tunnel, so we have double protection. And this is the method that is used by famed market gardener Elliot Coleman to grow greens in the winter in Maine. Through the winter, his primary growing season for his greens business that he sells to restaurants and other people, is basically growing off season. So he's growing from the fall through the spring, and this is the method he uses to do that. Unheated greenhouses with multiple layers of protection. So you could do this if you had a small high tunnel. You could also put low tunnels inside of it to provide extra frost protection during the winter. In the spring, though, typically you're going to need like a single layer to protect against the occasional frost that may come towards the end of the winter season. Another method of season extension are called clochets. Traditional clochets, it's a French word, are a bell-shaped glass container, but you can use lots of different things as a clochet. Everything from like this water container to other plastic, or the idea is to make a little mini greenhouse just around the plant. And the final one I'll mention, which is not very often used, but can be quite effective, is to use a structure that provides works as a heat mass to create a microclimate in the proximity to the heat mass. So this is an example. We have a brick building, assuming that the south is to the left. During the day, the sun heats up the brick, and then in the evening and at night, it radiates the heat off, which means that the flower bed here that they've planted with vegetables, looks like tomatoes and peppers, that area is going to be warmer uh, throughout the day and especially at night than the rest of the yard, because it has this heat mass that's providing additional heat radiation, particularly at night, as the ambient air temperature in the surrounding area declines. All right. Let's talk about garden size. So a couple of basic methods of gardening. The two primary ones are going to be row garden, which is what's been used for hundreds of years, and a more recent method, uh, probably in the past 30, 40, 50 years, is one called square foot gardening, was popularized by a man named Mel Bartholomew. This is actually the method that my father used when I was growing up, so I'm very familiar with this method. And then the other basic method is containers. A lot of people don't necessarily have in-ground growing spaces or even raised beds, but they might just have containers on a patio or something, and you can have a great garden just in containers as well. Let's talk about layout. Um, so working on layout of your garden, you want to take sunlight into account. Make sure you're orienting the garden towards the south to get maximum sun exposure. You can utilize areas of shade to protect from afternoon heat and sun, like I mentioned earlier. If you do have the challenge of having some shade in your garden, particularly in the afternoon, you can actually use it to your benefit, particularly planting things like lettuce, where they will get shade in the late afternoon when the heat is the highest and the sun is most intense. That combination of factors of intense sun and high heat are what makes uh, heat intolerant plants to bolt and produce seed. So spinach, lettuce, things like that. There's all the other greens as well, like Asian greens, like mustards and these kind of things. That heat and intense sun will really rapidly accelerate that process. So if you can give them shade during that hottest part of the day, you can help them to survive longer in the garden, and therefore you can get a bigger harvest of the greens you're trying to get from them before they bolt and go to seed. Plant positioning, you want to place the tallest plants in the back or the north unless you're actually trying to create shade. And you should consider companion planting to create synergy between plants. I'll mention a little bit later about companion planting and a tool we have to help you figure out how to do that. So layout of the garden. You could throw a bunch of seeds in your garden into a jungle, kind of like this looks like. But you want to make sure you have adequate access for harvesting. That's really important. You won't, if you can avoid it, you don't want to step into your growing space um, to be working in the garden or to harvest, because when you put pressure on the ground, it compresses the soil and that can have a negative impact on what's growing there. So making sure that you can reach from your path into the growing space to harvest is an important thing that you want to consider when you're doing your garden layout. Next, let's talk about choosing varieties. What should I plant? When people ask me this question, the first thing I mention is actually I respond with a question. I said, "What will you eat?" If you don't like spicy food, you probably shouldn't be planting hot peppers, right? But if you love salsa, you better be planting some cilantro and some hot peppers. I always recommend that people prefer heirloom. There are a lot of hybrid varieties out there as well, but there's so many amazing heirloom varieties that are available that it really, I think, behooves you to try a lot of different ones out and see what you like, because there's so much variety, and as they say, variety is the spice of life. These beans, for instance, they're green beans, quote unquote green beans, but they're not green. They're a light yellow and they have purple streaks on them. They're called dragon tongue beans. They are our favorite bean of all the beans that we grow for a couple reasons. Besides that, they're extremely beautiful. They're extremely prolific as well. Actually, produce 2 to 3 times as much in the same space as many other green bean varieties. So we really like these. But if you are just thinking, hey, green beans are green, and you don't want to try a yellow and purple striped green bean, then you would maybe missing out on bigger production in your garden of something like a dragon tongue bean. So this is actually another point here too, is that it's good to try different varieties out, because certain varieties may grow very well for you in your garden space and with your soil. Um, and so even if you found ones that you like, I think it's always good to be testing. It's kind of like gardening is like a science experiment. We should always be testing new hypotheses and testing new things to see what works and what doesn't, because we can always improve. Optimizing production for your space is important, obviously. A lot of people are really limited on their space in their gardens, so trying to optimize what you can get out of it is really important. Some tips here. If you are very limited on space, then you have to be wise about what you plant and what you don't plant. For instance, for many, many years, for a number of years, I grew eggplant, but I found that it was bushy and it had limited production, and we don't eat a ton of eggplant. So I decided after a while, you know what? Eggplant's probably not the best use of my space. I'd much rather plant peppers or tomatoes there that I get a lot more production out of, and it's something that we eat all the time. Corn is probably one of the biggest ones that a lot of people like, but don't necessarily have space for. Corn, you're typically only going to get 1 or 2 ears of corn from each plant, and the planting space that you need to plant for is about 1 square foot per plant, which means that if you've only got a 400 square foot garden space, then planting 100 square feet of corn is probably not going to give you much room for a lot of other stuff that you want to plant. So I would recommend, if you like sweet corn, but you have a very small garden space, don't grow corn in your garden, grow other stuff, and find a local farmer who's growing organic corn to buy from them, particularly buying in bulk by the bushel or something, and you can get a good deal that way. Look for veggies with multiple edible parts. Some examples are sweet potatoes. Highly recommend those. Sweet potatoes are a superfood, and most people don't know this, but the leaves are edible when cooked. And honestly, sweet potato greens are probably my favorite. Anything else, they are both the texture and the flavor are just phenomenal, and they're super, super good, as well as good for you. The gotcha is you can't harvest too many because they're the solar panels for the sweet potatoes, and if you want big sweet potatoes, you can't take too many. So typically, if you're harvesting foliage from a plant that is also producing a root, you don't want to harvest more than 5 to 10% of the foliage at a time, so that you're not negatively impacting the solar collection capability of the plant. Another one, very popular in the South, but not necessarily in other places, are turnips and turnip greens. Turnips are actually what help the survive the war between the states, particularly when the Union armies marched through the South and destroyed everything. They were on the verge of mass starvation, and turnips are one of the things that help them to literally survive and not starve to death, because turnips grow fairly quickly. You can harvest the greens, again, a limited amount, but you can harvest the greens for eating. And, turnip greens cooked is a staple Southern delicacy. But then you also have a root crop you can harvest that will store through the winter and provide additional nutrition for a long period of time. So turnips are a great one to consider as well because of that multiple edible parts thing. All right. One important thing you wanted to consider is when you're figuring out what plant, look at the days to maturity of each variety compared to your season length. Um, all of these different winter squash varieties are really cool looking and fun to grow if you have the space. However, if you have a really short season, realize some winter squash and pumpkins can take over 100 days to grow, even over 120 days to grow, and you might be pushing the limits of what you can grow in your growing season, your season length. If you're trying to grow some of these long season vegetables, so just take that into account and be careful about that. All right, how many seedlings should you plant? This is a very good question, and one you should consider, obviously, because you don't want to waste a bunch of your seeds and plant a bunch of seedlings that you don't have room for in your garden. The first thing you want to do is determine the space used by each variety. The way that you do this, I'm going to use a couple different use cases. One is using a row garden spacing, which is fairly common. Okay, your space used by each variety of plant that you're going to be growing is basically the plant spacing, or the spacing between the plants, times the number of plants, which would give you basically in a row how many plants are in that row, right? and the space between them. And then you multiply that times your row spacing, the number of the inches or feet between rows. Okay, so here's an example with the same five vegetable types I mentioned earlier. If you're going to plant 10 basil plants, um, recommended spacing for basil is 12 inches apart. Row spacing between rows is also 12 inches or a foot, which means that your total area is going to be 10 square feet for 10 basil plants, because 1 foot times 1 foot is 1 square foot times 10 plants is 10 square feet. Broccoli, if you're going to plant 6 plants, recommended spacing is 24 inches, so 2 feet apart, times 1 foot apart spacing in the rows. That gets you 12 square feet for the 6 plants. Lettuce is less than a foot spacing, so for 24 plants, you're going to have 16 square feet. And then peppers and tomatoes are shown here. Basically, you end up using a lot of space for certain types of vegetables like tomatoes. If you're using recommended spacing, like tomatoes are often recommended 2 feet apart and 3 feet between rows. There are ways to make your spacing tighter. And for instance, when we do tomatoes, we plant them about 14 to 16 inches apart, and we on cattle panels, which is kind of like a rigid fence structure. We actually do 2 plants, one on each side of the trellis, about a foot apart, and then they go onto the trellis from each side. And then, like I mentioned, 14 to 16 inches apart. And then we'll have a path on each side to be able to get to the tomatoes to harvest them. So we can get a lot more plants into a given area that way, but it's very, very full, right? This spacing is considering if you have standalone plants using something like a tomato cage, then you need to have more spacing between them, both so that they don't interfere with each other, but also you can basically get in there to harvest them. Harvesting is a lot of what drives these plant spacing numbers. There's something called intensive spacing, which basically reduces these numbers, not necessarily by a steady factor, but for instance, if you're planting lettuce, you may end up almost doubling the number of lettuce plants you have in a given space over what the recommended spacing is shown here. The reason for that is because even though you're going to get less production per plant, because they're going to be, when they're fully mature, they're going to be touching each other and kind of overlapping each other, the amount that you produce within the space you have available ends up being much more, because there's less blank space in the garden that is not covered with foliage from the lettuce. Okay. So that's row garden spacing. If you're using square foot gardening, it's extremely simple, because there's a factor for each type of plant that says, hey, plant this many plants per square foot. If it's something big like a cabbage, it might be 1. If it's something like lettuce, it might be 4. If it's something small like carrots, it might be 16. But it's just that number per square foot times the number of plants that tells you how many square feet you have. So fairly straightforward. One thing important is to think about is seedling attrition. When you're planting seeds, whether it's indoors in trays that you're going to transplant outdoors later, or whether it's planting in the garden, you have to take into account the fact that some seedlings are not going to make it. Either some seeds are not going to germinate. So germination rates, typically on the high end are 90%. But if you have older seed, that will decline. It declines at different rates for different types of seed. So if you're using a year or 2-year-old or even 3-year-old seeds, you might have less germination. So the older the seed, typically, the more you're going to want to plant in a given area. So you want to plant some extra and then prune the weakest off, or you can transplant them depending upon what the setup is. It's important to realize you can also have seedling attrition from transplant shock. So make sure you have more than you need. You're always going to have like a fudge factor, that you have extra seedlings, because if you plan to plant 10 basil plants in your garden and you have space for 10, but you only plant 10 seedlings, what if after you transplant them, 2 of them die? Well, now you have 2 blank spaces, right? So have some extra. Plant If you're going to plant 10, like plant a dozen, like have a dozen seedlings so you have some extra. And then if you have extras, you know, you can plant them in a pot or give them to somebody else or something. So always have more than you need. Also, it's good to plant the strongest in the garden, and then the ones that seem weakest or slowest to grow, put those in a pot and either grow them in a container for that year, or you can give them away to a friend or something like that. But typically, it's best to plant your strongest plants in your garden. They're going to be the ones that are going to grow the fastest and thrive. All right, crop rotation. Crop rotation is can get complicated. However, at its core, it is simply a um, method of multi-year planning to increase yield and fertility of your garden. So crop rotation is based on the principle that has been observed over many hundreds or even thousands of years that some crops do best following others from the year before. Some examples of this are potatoes best after corn. Legumes are good preceding crops because they fix nitrogen. All legumes, such as beans and peas, fix nitrogen in the soil. So if you're trying to improve your soil, it is good to plant legumes to do that. They basically take the sunlight, water, air, and organic matter from the soil, and through their roots fix nitrogen in the soil and improve the soil for other plants that need more nitrogen than your soil may provide. Some crops do poorly following others, so you want to avoid these if you can. Carrots, beets, and cabbages generally are detrimental to following crops. Um, so carrots and beets are both root crops, tend to pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil into the root, and cabbages have a similar effect. So really quick and dirty on crop rotations. There are entire books written on this topic, and if it's something that you incorporate into your gardening, I highly recommend getting a good book on the topic and reading it to come up with your crop rotation plan. Ah, yes, the bane of the gardener's existence. So, if you have predators, particularly mammalian predators in your area, it's really important that you fence your garden to keep them out. Deer are typically the biggest offenders, but you can have others such as rabbits, groundhogs, gophers, moles, so on and so forth. So it's important to try to fence all those out, realizing that some fencing may not work for some of those predators. In other words, if you have a welded wire fence that has large openings that are like 6 or 8 inch squares, a rabbit's going to get through that. So you may need to add some additional fencing down the lower portion that's small enough that the rabbit can't get through. If you have chickens or other farm animals, they can be their crops. We particularly have had problems with chickens, and especially with certain things like tomatoes. Chickens love to go and find bright colored tomatoes and peck at them, often before they're ripe. And so, if you don't want your chickens eating your tomatoes, you need to keep them out of the garden, and typically you have to use that fencing or something like that. One thing we do with our chickens is that we will basically put them in a different part of our homestead away from the gardens, and particularly we will put um, a fence netting around their shelter or whatever. We pasture most of our chickens, so we kind of move them around. They're not always free range though, and one of the times we make sure that they're not free range is when we have vegetable produce coming into maturity that they might damage, and we'll basically put up a perimeter fence around them that will keep them in their area and not let them go out to ravage the garden. Underground predators like moles and gophers can be a big problem for some people, particularly with root crops, but also others that they eat the roots of. And if you've got kids, they're cute and cuddly, and they're actually intended to eat vegetables when they're ripe, but kids don't always know when they're ripe, and often will pick things when they're not ripe, or too many of them at one time or whatever. So the big thing with children is just giving them proper guidance and boundaries that they can be able to follow so they don't harvest things before they're ripe, is probably one of the biggest problems that I've seen having 7 children and been gardening for our entire lives. All right. This is one thing that a lot of people have challenges with, which is that they have very limited space on their property to garden, space to put an in-ground garden, or uh, maybe their backyard doesn't get a lot of sun, and so the only place that they can put like things that the only place they can put grow things that will get full sun, which is what most plants need, is in their front yard. Some people will have live in an HOA or something and have rules or a covenant or something that prevents them from having gardens in their front yard. If you don't have those restrictions about having garden in your front yard, but your backyard is shaded, then consider growing in your front yard. You can make them beautiful. Make like these raised beds on the right here are very pretty. Um, and these days, I don't think as many people have a big deal with them. However, if you do have either HOA restrictions or some other kind of problem, maybe neighbors that are going to hassle you, you can make a stealth garden, like what is shown on the left, which looks like a nicely landscaped flower bed, but hidden in it are all kinds of edible plants. For instance, the big green bushy things in the front middle of the picture are actually nasturtiums, which are flowers, but they're edible. On the right behind them are some red chard. Behind that, you've got some herbs. There's some red okra in front of the little obelisk there. All kinds of edible stuff growing in what looks like a flower garden or a nicely landscaped decorative garden. So there are ways to do that, and I'm going to mention in a minute a resource that can help you tackle that challenge if that is your challenge. So if you are restricted on what you can grow, consider an edible landscaping approach. The resource that I recommend is the book Gardening Like a Ninja by my friend Angela England. This basically talks about how to sneak edibles into your landscape, how to plan your landscaping, your flower beds, that kind of thing, to put edible plants into them and be able to still grow lots of food, even with the restrictions and constraints that you're facing. All right, let's talk about some variables. There's some time-based variables. Season extension, successive plantings are some of those. Space-based variables are vertical gardening and stacking, what I call stacking. I'll explain that in a minute. These are variables that you control that you can help to increase the production of your garden. And in particular, they're going to be things that you're going to want to try most likely, regardless of what your situation is. So successive planting is basically just a way of optimizing the space available you have for planting by planting not just once, but multiple times, particularly after you're harvesting the first crop in a given space. So this is the example would be, you have some beets that are mature, you pull them out, now you have room available, and then you go and plant something else in their space after you've harvested them, right? Well, one way that you can get even more production out of your space is if you time it right by planting seedlings indoors or somewhere else in trays ahead of time. When you harvest that crop, let's say it's beets, you can transplant plants, seedlings, into that space right after them, which essentially like accelerates your timeline for getting that new crop to maturity. Rather than planting a seed and having it germinate and then having its whole life ahead of it, at that point, if you've already planted the seed in a tray somewhere and then transplant it, you can cut off several weeks to over a month of time in the maturity of that second plant. Very good for salad greens. Radishes can also be planted with a slow growing crop. And because radishes grow so quickly, typically they're ready in about 3 weeks, you can often harvest radishes out of the space where they're in before the plants they're planted next to get to the point where they're having a competition with them. Another space productivity method is vertical gardening methods. And this is everything from trellises, like I mentioned earlier, that we do with our tomatoes, which you can see in the top right here, to old, like Three Sisters method that the Native Americans taught to the English settlers up in New England, which is shown on the left. Three Sisters being pole beans growing on corn with winter squash vining out underneath the corn. So trellises, cow panels or cattle panels are my favorite method. Primary reason being that they're very easy to go up. Cattle panels are 4 feet tall, 16 feet long. If you have a large garden, it works better than if you have a very small garden. But if you do have a small garden, you can actually cut these in half, or you can basically make them in smaller sizes. We basically put 3 T-posts in the ground, one on each end and one in the middle, and then we use zip ties to connect the cattle panel to it. So it goes up really quick. And then it provides a great trellis for everything from cucumbers, like you see here, to pole beans, to tomatoes, to basically anything that climbs will do great on cow panels because they have nice big openings. The best part about these that I like is the fact that when the growing season's done, particularly when you have vining crops like cucumbers or tomatoes, the vines die back and now you've got these vines twisted around your trellis. Well, it's a lot easier with a rigid structure like a cattle panel to rip off that dead plant material than it is if you have what I'm going to show you in a minute, which is like a soft grid trellis that doesn't, it gets tangled and all that kind of stuff. So I'll show you an example of that in a minute. A very simple one that a lot of people have used for thousands of years is twine or strings. You can set up some simple frame for them to connect to and then have them go down to the ground. It's very effective for beans like this. The alternative that some people use for growing pole beans and other climbing, vining crops like cucumbers is some form of netting, whether it's nylon, solid nylon, or nylon rope, almost like a twine that's woven together into a grid. I used to use these before I switched to cow panels, but I found that it was very difficult to take all the dead plant material off of them, and even harder to try to store it over the winter without getting it all tangled. The best thing I could figure out was basically wrapping it around a PVC pipe and like rolling it up, but I still had issues. So to cattle panels, and it's a higher startup cost with cattle panels. They cost about $20 each for the cattle panels, and you're probably looking at $5 or $6 per T-post, but they'll and they're very easy to put up and to deal with as opposed to the netting, which is going to break down if it's some kind of plastic or even sisal twine or something like that. So that's one reason that I recommend cattle panels if you have the budget and the circumstance to make those work. Cages are another form. Most popular with tomatoes, but can also be used for peppers and other things that need some. You can buy these or you can actually make your own. I believe this particular cage is actually made a rebar grid that's been cut and then basically rolled into a cylinder. And then, as I mentioned, plants, the Three Sisters method, basically using a plant as the trellis. My favorite Three Sisters method, I'll mention in a minute. My favorite plant as a trellis method, I'll mention in a minute. Um, I've done this many times before. It works fairly well, though corn is not the ideal trellis for a vining plant like a pole bean. So I'll leave it at that. Containers is another method of vertical gardening. Most people don't think of it this way, but if you think of it as you don't have a lot of lateral space in the ground to grow in, if you're going to grow vertically, which means up, then containers are actually a method of doing that. What you're doing is just putting the growing medium into a pot or a container of some sort and growing on top of something else, like a deck or a porch or a patio or something, right? Lastly, one method of vertical gardening that is very important, can be very important if you live in an apartment or something like that, is some kind of hanging container or planter box. It can be everything from this very pretty um, three-tiered number on the right to something as straightforward and functional as using gutters attached to a wall to grow greens and small crops in. This is, I think, actually a brilliant idea, because if you've got very little um, space in the ground on the south-facing side of your house to grow in, then this allows you to basically put your growing medium up into a space that otherwise could not be. And I mean, look at this guy. Look at all the greens he's growing in this space, like on a wall. It's pretty brilliant use of space, I have to say. The next method, which is a form of vertical gardening, but I refer to it as stacking. The Three Sisters method is the best known version of this. There's two ways to do it. One is based on timing. Um, and by stacking, I mean you're stacking multiple plants in the same physical space or in close proximity to each other, right? So carrots and lettuce is an example. If you plant, if you're planting carrots, um, if you use recommended spacing, it's going to be a really long time before the foliage from the carrots closes the gap between those rows, right? You've got this gap between them. Let's say it's like 6 or 8 inches or something, and nothing's growing there except for weeds, right? Well, if you plant a row of lettuce between your row of carrots, your lettuce can grow to getting a nice small head of lettuce before the carrots really get that mature. And if you give the lettuce a little bit of head start, it's even better. And then basically, once the lettuce gets big enough to mature, to harvest it, you can take it out, and then the carrots keep growing and fill in the space. So you're basically getting more out of the space instead of letting unplanted ground just sit there for weeds to grow in. The other method of stacking is based on height. And an example of this is planting basil at the base of your tomatoes. Now, um, if you're going to do them very close, it requires that you prune the lower foliage off of your tomatoes, which I highly recommend anyways. It's something that we always do, primarily for blight mitigation. We prune the lower one foliage off of our tomatoes as they grow. Obviously, we don't prune it all off, but we prune off the lower branches um, over time as the plant grows taller. And what that does is opens up the air to flow underneath the plant, which reduces the amount of moisture that collects in the leaves, which reduces the amount of blight, which is a fungal spore that spreads it spreads in moist environments. The other nice thing about it is it frees up space because the vines don't take up much space and they don't create a lot of shade or anything. You can plant basil within about 6 inches of your base of your tomatoes. And because basil and tomatoes are companion plants, they do well together when planted near each other. Your basil can grow up into the space your tomato foliage was, and you have a nice little companion pairing there. Probably one of my favorite is any kind of shade tolerant plant being planted under okra. The reason for this is that okra, as you can see here, It's kind of like a woody stemmed plant when it gets mature, but as it grows, it has these leaves with these long stems on them. And even though they have large leaves, the leaves are all kind of spread out. So it kind of produces like a dappled shade. And for many years, I've grown squash stacked with my okra. I put the okra in the middle and then put the squash on the outside, summer squash. And as long as you time it where you give the okra a little bit of a head start so they grow up above the foliage of the squash still do pretty well, and the okra is growing in the same space. You're getting two plants growing in the same space. The other thing that's really great is if you plant pole beans at the base of the okra, because okra is about an ideal trellis for a pole bean to climb up, as opposed to corn, where it gets kind of sometimes it'll climb out on one of the leaves and then doesn't have anything to support it. As you can see from the plant structure of okra, provides a much better trellis support for something like pole beans. All right, getting towards the end here, production and output. Let's talk about how do you figure out how much you're going to grow, right? And, this picture is from our porch last summer when the tomatoes were all coming in, and I think we were getting apples and zucchini and all kinds of other stuff too. So we had a ton of stuff. Um, Calculating yields for vegetables. You want to figure out what kind of yield you can expect or want to get from vegetables for a couple different things. In particular, ones like how much you're going to eat fresh, obviously, but also ones that need processing, whether it's freezing, canning, or drying. Um, any that need cold storage, root crops, or winter squash. And the reason why it's important to figure out like what you're going to get from this, let's say you plant 20 tomato plants. Well, how much tomatoes is that going to give you? It's important that you know what that's going to look like, because if you're going to be canning those tomatoes, you need to have the supplies ready to can them, right? If you've been canning for years and you know what you're going to need, then that's not a big deal. But if you want to pick up canning this year, you need to kind of know how much canned goods, how much canning jars, how many lids and rings and all that kind of stuff you're going to need in order to can those tomatoes that you have coming from your garden. One thing I have to recommend from doing this for decades, we've had children and been doing it for well over a decade with family. Think about the impact of your gardening, particularly the harvest season, on your life. Don't go on vacation in the end of July or in August, um, if you can avoid it, right when your big wave of tomatoes is coming in, and then whoever's watching your house has to go out and harvest them, that kind of thing, right? So plan your work and life schedule around harvest times if you can, so that you're there and available to do the harvesting, and particularly the processing if you're processing things. You can do this by adding the maturity days to your planting date to figure out, hey, when is the harvest going to start coming in for these plants? If you're doing your planning on the front end to figure out when you need to plant things by, all you have to do is look at the days to maturity for those crops to figure out, well, when is the other end going to look like? When is the harvest going to come? And that will give you an idea of how you can plan around that. So if you're planning vacations or other events, you can make sure you're not making your life too hectic because you didn't plan ahead. Another thing you can do is to stagger your planting dates of different crops, particularly ones that need processing, with the end in mind, so you smooth the workload over time. One of the most challenging things we've found in processing lots of vegetables is that if you have multiple types of vegetables coming in all at the same time, it could be overwhelming. Uh, Particularly when you have tomatoes coming in and they're coming in hot and heavy, you're probably going to be doing a lot of tomato canning, and you don't necessarily want to be canning a bunch of other stuff. So if you can stagger stuff in your planting so that the harvest comes in a more smooth distribution, then you can help make your life a little bit easier, because you're not having to deal with 3, 4 different types of things all at once. The problem really becomes when you get to a large scale, kind of like our family does, where we're growing, hundreds of tomato plants and lots of other things, is that often the time it takes to process them makes it such that you risk losing some things from going bad unless you have a lot of refrigerator space or a walk-in cooler or something like that. This picture is from, I think, 2 years ago when we had a bumper crop of tomatoes, and we had a storm coming in, as you can see there in the distance, and we were trying to harvest tomatoes as a family before we got some potentially severe weather and gusty winds and stuff that might have damaged the plants. So we were all out there scrambling to try to pick them and get them inside before the rain came. It's one of my favorite pictures from the garden. Another thing I can recommend to make your harvesting go easier is to have good harvesting equipment and methods. The crates that I showed earlier, let me see if I can go back real quick to show it to you. These crates here are basically ventilated crates. They're actually designed for produce. I bought these from a guy that had like a small ethnic grocery store, and he was basically they got all the produce shipped to them in these things, and they were selling them for like $1 a piece or something like that. So I went and picked up a bunch of them, and they've been awesome for helping to um, organize our produce, and particularly like make sure that it has airflow, right? If it doesn't have airflow, then things can go bad really quickly. So having crates like this that have airflow around them is really important. And then in this picture, you see apron. Well, this is called a Roo apron. We have these available on our website, but this is like your best friend when you're doing garden work, whether it's weeding or planting, but particularly during harvesting, because it's got this pouch in it that you can put your produce in. And then once it's full, and this is particularly good if you're doing like weeding or trimming or something, the bottom, these little ropes come off, the little hooks, and then the bottom opens up and it's like a chute and it all dumps out. This can also be good even for harvesting things. You just got to be careful when you're dumping out tomatoes or something, right, to do it gently. But it's super handy because then you're not trying to use your I know everybody's been there, right, who's gardened before. You go out in the garden to check on things, you're like, oh, this is ripe and this is ripe, and all of a sudden your t-shirt, you're like holding the front of it up, and it's piled full of tomatoes and squash and all kinds of stuff, and you come in showing off your belly and looking kind of ridiculous with all the produce you have in your shirt that you're stretching out. This helps to reduce or eliminate that problem by having a tool, in this case an apron, made specifically. Here's another picture of containers, some different kinds of crates, large Tupperware type plastic bins that are good for tomatoes and things. All right, so all these things, whether it's aprons or crates and these kind of things, having things they're good to harvest in. If you're harvesting something that needs to be cut, maybe like lettuce or something like that, having a good harvesting knife. Those are the kind of things that are going to make your life easier. All right, last section, preserving harvest. Grow what you eat and what you preserve, right? So obviously you want to grow what you eat in season, but if you eat a lot of tomatoes throughout the year, it makes sense to preserve a lot of your tomatoes as tomato sauce, spaghetti sauce, whatever, for later use as well, if you have the time and inclination to do that. Some methods of preservation, and you're probably aware of a lot of these. I'm just going to go over them for those that may be uninitiated. Drying is one of the oldest methods and one of the easiest methods in a lot of ways. You can air dry things. You can get dehydrators to help speed that process. There's also solar dehydrators that can speed the process. The nice thing about drying is that a lot of the nutrition is preserved, and usually water is what things going bad and spoiling or rotting. By taking the water out, you'll enable for that vegetable matter to be preserved for quite a long time without refrigeration, right? That's the key, is that it doesn't require refrigeration. Freezing is probably the easiest. However, it is the one that requires freezer space and electricity. And as we've seen recently with some of the winter storms, electricity ain't always around, even though it normally is. So if you have a lot of frozen produce, make sure you have a backup plan for if the power goes out for an extended period of time so that your stuff doesn't go bad. And this might be like if you're like our family and you have a lot of for particular, if you have a long-term outage, you may need to actually convert that vegetable or fruit that's in frozen form into some other form you can use, such as canning it, making jams, jellies, that kind of thing. Then there's canning, probably the most popular method, mostly because it puts it in a form store for a long time and is also easy to use. In most cases, canned foods can be put right into recipes without, it doesn't require rehydration or anything like that, like a drying method does. And then there's cold storage, root crops and such as carrots, turnips, potatoes, beets, all the sweet potatoes, all these things are root crops. And then also in same kind of category, they're not root crops, but they're also often fashion, are winter squash and pumpkins, which store for long periods of time in cool conditions and allow you to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor, literally, well into the winter and even the spring before the next summer's produce starts coming in. And last but not least, fermentation has been coming back into vogue, mostly because this very ancient, well-established heritage method of preservation actually increases the healthiness of many foods. Many popular traditional foods are fermented, such as sauerkraut, kimchi from Korea. All of these things are fermented, and what it does is it basically, in a way, pre-digests the food and adds in beneficial bacteria that's good for your digestive system. So when your garden is producing like crazy, your porch may look something like ours does, like this in the summer. But you gotta, you can't just eat all of it at once. You gotta put it into a form that you can use later, whether that's canning vegetables like this, or whether it's root crops like onions and potatoes. Um, all of these different methods can be part of your game plan to not only produce a great harvest, but also to preserve it for later use. So as the presentation is coming to an end, I mentioned a couple things. One, hopefully you can give this presentation a thumbs up because I put this together for you and hopefully it's been helpful to you. We also got a surprise for you that hopefully will be pleasing and be helpful to you. Obviously, our company Seeds for Generations is all about bringing heirloom seeds from our families to yours. Our kids are involved in every step, planting seeds, growing the garden, harvesting the seeds, packing them into packets, doing order fulfillment. We do this as a family together because it's a great way for our kids to learn important skills and to be able to work together and earn money for the future. So we'd love to be able to support your family and your need for seeds. I'll have a note in a minute about a sale we have coming up. But first, I want to mention available. I mentioned earlier when I went through the like timeline planning, like how when do you plant what kind of seed. You can go through that calculation process with every type of seed yourself, but it will be quite laborious, take a lot of time. I built a garden planning calculator, put in your last spring frost date in that little orange cell there, and instantaneously calculate all of your planting dates, both your indoor planting dates as well as your outdoor planting dates. And this can be super helpful for you to save a lot of time and cut down on calculation error. If you haven't already used it, you can click the link that's below on the page or go to seedsgenerations.com/GPC to go get the free garden planning calculator. I also want to mention some other really great resources that we have available for you. My friend Melissa Norris is a fifth generation homesteader. a wife and mom, a blogger and podcaster at Pioneering Today. And her family produces 50% of their own vegetables, 3/4 of their own fruit, and all of their own meat. She last year released a book called The Family Garden Plan that is the best book that I've found to help you go through this process I've been talking about in this webinar. It has a lot more detail, and particularly has a lot of good tips, not just how to like plan based on your family's needs, but even things that I didn't talk about today, like how to include perennial plants, fruit trees, berries, all that kind of stuff, and has a lot of time-saving tips and techniques. It also has a ton of great reference information in the book that can be super helpful for you year after year. And late last year, she also released a companion planner notebook. There's charts and worksheets in it, monthly instructions based on your zone that you're in, customized plan using yearly, monthly, and weekly charts, and a really cool little elastic strap that goes around it to keep it contained. So this is a really great thing if you like to have a paper notebook to put all your notes and stuff in. This has got everything you need in it. So I mention this because these are resources that can be super helpful for the topic we're talking about in this training, but also we've put them on sale for our sale that we're launching right now called the Plan Your Garden Sale. You can get this book in her planner notebook standalone or together, but we've also put it into a Plan Your Garden book bundle, which hopefully is something worth considering for you if you've already if you don't already have them. So in addition to Melissa's book and notebook, there's a book we started carrying a few months ago called The Backyard Winter Gardener, which has a lot of great information in it, not just for winter gardening, but basically if you want to start growing stuff now while it's still winter, this is the book to get. How to grow produce through the winter without any artificial heat, light, anything like that. Talks about how to build cold frames, hotbeds, even geothermal greenhouses, and really helps you to basically extend your growing season and increase your food supply through the months when most people are not gardening at all. And the other book that's included in this book bundle is the Gardening Like a Ninja book I mentioned earlier, which has a lot of great tips on how to find the right vegetation for your growing zone, how to use your seasons to create beauty year round, right? So you kind of always have something in bloom or producing, how to cultivate what might seem like unusable areas, and then also how to harvest fruits and veggies and nuts from everywhere throughout your landscape without your HOA even knowing, if that is your challenge, right? So from now through Monday, for the next few days, we've got a Plan Your Garden sale going on. You can get that garden planning book bundle I just mentioned, as well as our garden planning toolkit I'm going to talk about in a second. Both at big discounts. Plus, you can get free shipping, and the premium version of our garden planning calculator, which has some extra bells and whistles. You can download it, have it for reference on your own computer, and be able to print it easily. That is available for seed orders over $50. And then just a reminder that sale is going to end on Monday night, March 1st. So click the link, the little banner below the video, or go to seedsgenerations.com/planyourgarden for info on that. Now, our premium garden planning toolkit is a collection of resources that is basically a bunch of great tools that will really help you with your garden planning. The first one is the premium version of the garden planning calculator, which is the $10 value. We also have a fall planting calculator, which is the tool that I mentioned earlier that will help you figure out your latest planting date to plant your fall garden so that you still get a harvest before the fall frost. We've also got a companion planting matrix, which basically is a matrix showing all of the most common vegetables that are grown in the garden, and which ones are companions to each other, which ones are antagonists to each other, or which ones are neutral. And this is a reference guide that will tell you basically which things you need to plant next to each other and which things you should keep away from each other. And lastly, this tool called the herb planting calculator I created last year that basically helps you figure out like when do you need to plant your dill so that it's ready when you're going to be canning your pickles, right? Or when do you need to have your cilantro planted in order for it to be ready for making salsa when your tomatoes come due, right? So a lot of times, one of the biggest challenges with either cooking or in particular with canning is having the right ingredients available at the right time. And we usually screw this up in our family, and that's why I created this tool to make it easier to figure out like when you need certain things together, when you need to plant them by, so that you have them ready and they're ready to harvest at the right time. So those 4 tools plus 3 bonus video training sessions. One on planning basics, which covers some of the material in this session and some others as well. Tips and techniques to growing some of our favorite vegetables. A lot of variety recommendations in this training. And the last one is intermediate gardening tips, which has everything from more advanced season extension recommendations to a lot of other techniques that I didn't cover in depth in this presentation. So with that said, we'll take questions now. Go ahead and enter your questions if you haven't already, and we will take them as they come in. I'm going to pull up my question sheet here and start pulling these up to answer. If you can't stick around, I totally understand. It is late, and the presentation went long in part because of the technical problem that we had. So let's see here. I'm going to mute my mic for just a sec while I get a drink of water, so I'll be right back. Okay, if you haven't already asked your question, please put it in the chat box in the lower right corner of the screen. If the chat is not showing up for you there, then please use the green Q&A tab on the lower left-hand part of the screen to submit your questions, and we'll answer them as we're able in the order they were received. All right, so first question is from Amy about bugs. All right, so I'll give the specific question and get to that in a second, but I didn't mention insect predators in this presentation. I was mostly talking about mammals and stuff like that. Insects are one of the biggest predators for many types of crops. Amy's question specifically is about Japanese beetles. She says we have Japanese beetles and they're getting worse each year. Last year, so much of our garden was destroyed. How can we plan and plant large gardens to be more self-sufficient when our efforts are rapidly consumed by insects? I prefer not to use toxic chemicals. Also, what can I do to avoid being eaten by mosquitoes? They love to rest under the leaves of the plants and come out and bite when disturbed. She's in Minnesota. Well, Minnesota is the land of lakes, so mosquitoes are probably a problem there regardless. You might try, for mosquitoes, you might try just some natural insect repellent on you personally. There are some essential oils in particular that can be really helpful with that. As far as Japanese beetles, the best thing I've found with Japanese beetles is to use traps. They have a attractant, it's like a pheromone that's in the trap, and you have to place the trap in the right place so that you attract the beetles away from your garden instead of towards it. Depending on your property configuration, this might be difficult, but Um, Japanese beetles are largely they are a difficult challenge because they do a lot of foliage damage. Um, so traps are one. Another one, which might be in conjunction with that, is what's called a trap crop. That is planting something that your troublesome insect likes in a area away from your main part of your garden, so that they'll go there and eat that instead of eating the stuff that you want to eat. So you might look at that as well. Let's see. Mike asks if you're using cattle panels with inside where there is less sun. So I think this question is referring to using a cattle panel in an arch configuration. We I primarily use cattle panels um, where the short end is up and the long end is lateral across the garden. So I have a 16-foot cattle panel. I make a 16-foot trellis that's 4 feet tall, attached to cattle panel or attached to T-posts, and then I trellis my cucumbers or tomatoes or green beans, pole beans up onto that trellis, and then they grow up from there. If you're using a cattle panel in an arch configuration, where it's like an arbor, um, then really anything, it depends on what you're growing on the outside and how much shade it produces as to what you might grow on the inside. But anything that will do well in shaded areas. But the main one I can think of is going to be something like lettuce in the middle of the summer. It likes shade because it's going to be hot. But it really depends on what you're growing on the trellis itself and how much shade that produces as to what you can grow in the shade that it's producing. Uh, Lou asks, what's the best deer protection for small in-ground garden of sweet potatoes and pole beans? Well, yeah, sweet potatoes. They love the sweet potato greens, don't they? So for deer in general, I would say the first thing is going to be a tall fence, and by tall I mean like 6 to 8 feet. Deer can jump over 6 feet. So if you buy a deer fence, you can buy this like black netting, nylon netting that is typically 7 feet tall. I think they also have like an 8 foot tall version. Physical barrier is the best thing for deer. Um, Depending upon your situation, dogs can be good to keep deer away. If you can keep them out, particularly if you can have them outside and they can be out there at night to sense when deer are there and basically scare them off. Uh, the other thing would be a trap crop, like I mentioned earlier. That can be really good for deer. It depends on the size and the configuration of your property. If you got a small backyard, that may not be possible, but if you have a larger property, you might. In my experience, deer love beets and chard in that order. So you might plant some chard in an area that's away from your garden. And if you have your garden fenced and there's chard that's not, they're gonna find that chard and they're gonna be eating on that. Um, so those are some recommendations for deer protection. Deer can be particularly devastating because they eat so much so quickly, and pole beans are growing up, so they can kind of get to them. Unless it's in an area where it's hard for them to get to. Oh, I'll mention this too. If your garden is small, we had a small garden that was near a wood line and had a perimeter fence about 4 feet, which deer can jump over, about 4 feet tall. But inside of the perimeter fence, we had cattle panels for trellises. And we never found any deer inside that garden. And we think it was because they didn't like going in confined spaces where there was like vertical obstacles. So that might be something to consider too, is making a small fence space where you put the stuff that you know deer are going to really like. And in my experience, I hear you, sweet potatoes are one of the biggest ones that deer, they'll just mow those down like nobody's business real quick because they're really tasty greens. So sweet potatoes you might protect with a low tunnel with a fabric over them that basically provides like a physical barrier, and they may not even see it or be able to get to it that way. That might be something to consider as well. All right, folks, do you have any other questions? Please ask them now because we went a little long. I want to wrap up before it gets too late, but I do want to answer a few more questions. So, um, Tim asks, I'm growing fruit tree seedlings, which are pear, apple, and cherry. I have space on the terraces around the mulch now, but could I plant veggies under or around them instead of mulch? And if so, what would you recommend? And he says he's in Southwest Michigan. So, an excellent question. And this is kind of an example of stacking, like I mentioned before, except in this case, you're planting annuals around perennials. Um, yes, this can be done, and it is a method that has been done for quite some time. I would recommend looking at companion planting, like look because there's certain types of perennial trees that do well with certain annual crops, and then there's some that are antagonistic. So you want to make sure first that you're not planting antagonists next to each other. But what I would do, make it like uh, a cascade effect. So you're going to plant your tallest plants that are suitable for that particular tree closest to the tree. You can even plant things that climb as long as the tree's big enough. You can plant things that climb, including perennials like grapes. I mean, grapes naturally in natural habitat, grapes climb up trees. That's what they do, right? So you could plant grapes at the base of your trees if you wanted to, but just in terms of crops to plant near trees, you might look at pole beans or something like that if they're tall enough to support that. Um, and they're not going to have too much of a negative impact depending on the size of the tree. You don't want to have a really tiny tree you plant a pole bean on that just kind of overcomes it, right? Um, so vining plants like a pole bean would be one thing. You might be able to basically use the tree as a trellis. So that's one idea. Taller plants closer to the tree, things like I don't know, chard maybe, or you could even do something like a summer squash, which get pretty big. And then as you move out from that, from the base of the tree, do smaller stuff. So I'd primarily look, since you're going to be probably planting them pretty close together, I would primarily make the determination based upon um, what things are companions, um, what things are going to have good height differential, because you don't want the plants that are in front of others to shade them out. So your tallest ones in the back, and then like cascading down to the shortest ones. Those are the primary things that I would consider if I was going to do something like what you're asking. But it's a good question, something I haven't done because I haven't needed to, but definitely something worth thinking about. Another thing you can think about as well, I mentioned grapevines earlier. You could also do something like bramble fruit, raspberries, blackberries, stuff like that, at the base of trees as well. And then it's perennial with perennial, and you're not having to plant every year. So that's another, depending on where it's at on your property and how often you get there, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of different options. I would just do research about which things are companions and do well together. All right. If you have any other questions, post them now, please. I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes. Let's see here. Next question is Mike says, do you do any winter sowing? or straw bale gardening, and what do you think of these methods? Um, I don't do straw bale gardening. I haven't really had the need to. I actually thought about just doing it for kind of a gee whiz test. I know some people like it. I don't know, kind of big picture. I prefer growing in soil. So it's one of the same reasons I don't do hydroponics because it's kind of like an artificial way of getting to the same result, and I have enough soil growing space to be able to do that. Um, so I don't feel really the need to use straw bale gardening. Um, I do, however, I do use mulch, as you can see in the picture. I use quite a bit of mulch, wood chip mulch, a lot of times, depending on the circumstance. But so I've used kind of the garden back to Eden gardening method quite a bit over time. As far as winter sowing, not a whole lot. Working towards doing more cover crops and stuff like that. And we're also hopefully going to be putting in a high tunnel this year. So we're going to try to do more growing through the winter. But most of the winter growing that I've done has been using low tunnels and growing greens like lettuce and chard and similar things like that. So that's the most of my winter growing experience. So hopefully that is helpful to you. Let's see. Do, 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 do. All right. What's this next one? Oh, Deb asked a good question. If you plant, so this is about successive planting. So if you're going to do successive planting, after you harvest from one spot, before you plant a new plant or seed in that space, do you need to remineralize or recompost the soil? This is a great question. In general, when you're planting in your garden or harvesting and then replanting in your garden, it generally is a good rule to add compost, to add organic matter. It's not necessarily it's not necessary per se, but it's generally a good practice. Um, So it depends on the condition of the soil in that spot, what grew there before, some of the factors that went into crop rotation come into play here, such as you know growing legumes in a spot afterwards. They fix nitrogen in the soil. Now, typically, you're only pulling out. Well, it depends on what it is. Like pole beans, you're going to be pulling out at the end of the season. If you grow an early set of green beans and then they're done, or they get eaten by Mexican bean beetles and you pull them out, you might plant something new in the spot after that. But realize that legumes like beans or peas growing in that spot will have fixed nitrogen in that soil. So that soil should be nitrogen rich for whatever you plant in there after them. Now, when one of the spaces you should always look to plant new things in after you harvest from there are going to be when you harvest root crops like carrots or beets or something like that, because you're pulling the whole plant out, right? To harvest it, which means that there's all the space there is open, is remaining if you've harvested all of them in that row or whatever. However, as I mentioned in the section on crop rotation, um, root crops are generally detrimental when being preceding crops. They pull more nutrients out of the soil. So it's particularly important when you're harvesting root crops that you add more compost back to that spot when you plant before you plant or when you're planting, so that you are adding more nutrients in the soil for the next crop that comes along. So that's a very good question. Hopefully that was a um, helpful answer in that regard. All right, Angelique asks, will planting basil under tomatoes help with aphids? Um, It may. I'm assuming you're having plant aphids on your tomatoes. Um, Basil is well, depending on the variety, but basil is generally somewhat aromatic, and aromatic plants tend to deter, repel pests. However, I'm not sure specifically if basils repel aphids. Um, so I can't answer your question specifically, but I would say with aphids, um, they the nice thing about aphids is they tend to they hang out on the leaves, right? They just kind of sit there and walk around. They don't like, it's not like other bugs where they hop around or they fly away or whatever, right? So if you do have an aphid problem, it's a lot easier to get them by spraying them because when you spray them, they kind of just sit there and take it. They don't like try to get away. Um, and when I say spray, I'm talking about like organic pesticides. There are a number of options. Um, if you were to get one broad spectrum organic pesticide use, I'd recommend Pyganic. It's called Pyganic is the brand name or the trade name, I guess. Several different producers maybe, but it's not necessarily cheap. But you buy it in a concentrate form and you dilute it into a spray bottle or a pump sprayer and spray it on the plants. That's kind of my go-to when I really need to knock out some pests that are need to be put in their place. You can make your own less expensive pesticides as well. We have a recipe on our website for making a pesticide with neem oil and diatomaceous earth. And that's also a pretty good wide-ranging pesticide. It works well on squash bugs and other stuff like that. If you have worms, um, BT concentrate is what you want to get. That's a worm specific pesticide. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria that attacks and kills worms. So if you have cabbage worms, corn worms, any of those kind of worms, worms on brassicas are probably the most common. They're going to be on cabbage, especially. You're going to want to use BT for those. But I know you asked about aphids, and I haven't had a lot of problem with aphids on tomatoes. Um, but yeah, the nice thing about aphids is they don't really like run away. They just kind of sit there, so it's fairly easy to get them with an organic pesticide. All right, we're going to wrap up here, folks. I'm going to look for any other questions to answer before I go. Um, Here's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer this succinctly or without slides to demonstrate, but Julie asks, are there any tips or tricks for calculating how much space you need for a particular plant if you're choosing different methods, like using vertical gardening, for instance, for some of your plants? That is a good question. So I think what you need to do is you need to make your own like chart, kind of like I did earlier, and put in your own spacing. Like take the recommended spacing, even look up intensive spacing for specific plants, and then figure out what you think works for you. Sometimes it's going to be like an in-between number. If you're using vertical gardening, then you have to realize that the plant's growing up, not out. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier in my example with tomatoes, we grew our tomatoes a lot closer together than is recommended because of the way that we trellis them. So that you have to take that into account, right? If you're growing something like pole beans, typically, I think the spacing is going to be taken into account because they know that you're growing pole beans on a trellis. Like that's why they're called pole beans. So, but if it's something like cucumbers, that I think most of the time the spacing for cucumbers is based on a like a vining habit where they're growing out across the ground. We always trellis our cucumbers up onto a cattle panel so that they, for two reasons. One, they take less space, and the second is that the cucumbers don't get all dirty when it rains because they're up off the ground. Um, then you can plant them closer together. And we do the same method, like pretty much on all of our cattle panels. When we grow cucumbers, we do the same thing where we're planting two rows, one on each side of the cattle panel, separated from each other by 6 to 12 inches, depending on what kind of plant it is. And then we'll plant each seed or each plant in the row according to normal or intensive spacing. But then once they start growing, we're going to basically put them up on the trellis, and then the little tendrils grab on and hold them on there. Cucumbers and well, cucumbers are the ones you trellis more than melons. You can do melons in a similar way, but melons get so big you have to put them in a sling and stuff to hold them up. But cucumbers, you don't. So cucumbers, the thing about cucumbers when you're trellising them, even though the tendrils will hold on, they tend to kind of grow out away from the trellis or maybe laterally along the trellis, but they don't often grow through the trellis. So what we do is a couple times a week, walk the row of cucumbers and actually take the ends of the branches and stick them through the holes so that they're kind of zigzagging, alternating between the holes in the cattle panel. So it does take some manual effort for trellising. We do the same thing for tomatoes, where we're taking the branches that are hanging down and kind of taking them up and putting them through the trellis so that the trellis is holding them in place, and that works pretty well. But yeah, your spacing is going to depend on a lot of different factors, and it's going to be basically based upon how you're implementing the growing method, right? So hopefully that was helpful to you. All right, folks, I think we've got all the questions answered, at least all the ones I'm seeing. So I think we're going to wrap up real quick before we go. I just wanted to remind you that if you haven't already gotten it, you can get our free garden planning calculator via the link below on the page, or go to seedsgenerations.com/GPC. Also, our Plan Your Garden sale is on now through Monday, so check that out via the banner below the video, or go to Plan Your Garden, seedsgenerations.com/Plan Your Garden for all the info. Remember that there's lots of other great resources out there, including ones on our website. Our premium garden planning toolkit is available now for a huge discount, and our premium planning resources together, downloadable. You can put them on your computer and use them whenever you want, print them out. And then also the books. There's a lot of great books that we have, including Melissa Norris's Family Garden Plan book and her associated or companion planner notebook that goes with that. And then some of the other books I mentioned too can be really helpful for planning what will hopefully be your best garden ever this year. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to let us know, and we'd be happy to help you out. On behalf of my wife Shannon and all of our family, thanks so much for your time and attention. We look forward to serving in the future. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your week.